In this video, I'd like to discuss a little more in depth about Andrew Johnson and his role in Reconstruction. If you'd like a more general overview of Reconstruction, the entire time period, I will link last week's video in the top right and in the description that gives an overview of the entire time period. This video is just going to be focusing on Andrew Johnson himself and his role in Reconstruction, his plan, and the results. So Andrew Johnson faced a huge task in bringing the South back into the Union after the Civil War. And how did he attempt to do this? His policies were very lenient toward the South, part because he himself was from the South, and there were other reasons as well. What did he do? Among other things, this is not a complete list. It's important to understand that overall, Andrew Johnson let the South go back to how it was before the war began, the Civil War began. By doing that, he let pre-war governments basically reassume their roles and how they were before the war. He basically let the governments that ruled before the Civil War rule again. As I mentioned in last week's video, he pardoned most Southern whites except for generals and people that were wealthy landowners. Eventually, those pardons would get taken away. And throughout the war, obviously, the Union Army confiscated a bunch of land. And this land, which was intended for freed slaves, as I've mentioned before, slaves were supposed to be promised 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War once they were freed. Because, of course, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. And slaves were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule to go out on their own and start a farm. But that, of course, didn't happen. I'll get to that on the next slide. Another condition for reinstatement into the Union was the support of the support of the abolition of slavery. So in order to get back into the Union, slaves had to support the abolition of slavery and have slavery no longer be a thing. Because the North wanted to move on from the war and make sure it was fought for nothing. Wasn't fought for nothing, I should say. And lastly, Andrew Johnson wanted Southern states to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. Because, of course, the Southern Confederate states had rebelled during the Civil War. All of these different things came up with two main results. First, Northern outrage. This led to Congressional Reconstruction, also known as Radical Reconstruction, by the wing of the Republican Party known as Radical Republicans. I mentioned this in last week's video. You can go check that out for a little more explanation about Radical Republicanism. I'm not going to make a video on it. But the biggest result coming out of his policies of Reconstruction were that Southern governments were able to pass what is known as black codes, and I mentioned this last week in the video, but the 13th Amendment had a loophole that abolished slavery except when punishment for a crime. So Southern legislatures went ahead and jumped at this loophole in order to basically institute a system that was as close to slavery as legally possible, because of course slavery was now outlawed after the Civil War. And what exactly do these black codes do? They basically tried to control African Americans' lives in every way possible and make a system as much like slavery as possible, as I've said. That could be limiting economic freedoms. So that basically means that African Americans could not go out on their own and make life for themselves. Black codes stipulated, among a lot of other things, that African Americans must sign labor contracts to work for people in a system known as debt patronage, which is basically they worked to pay off debt to the landowners, and this system made it impossible to pay off that debt. The debt was so steep in the eyes of the landowners that slaves could never pay it off and thus always stay on the land. So there were labor contracts. It also criminalized African American joblessness, so it basically forced them into the system of working for people like they had under slavery to begin with. So that is just a brief overview of what Andrew Johnson's policies of Reconstruction were. I wanted to go a little bit deeper into what the Black Codes did. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Feel free to comment other topics in history you would like me to discuss. And as always, I will see you here next week with another video.